A lot of research starts with personal experience, and my start was living in an English-speaking family, growing up in a French-speaking village in Canada, with daily relationships with Indigenous or Native people. So from the very beginning, I was aware that there were other kinds of people in the world. Not everybody grows up with that kind of experience. And when I started to work, I worked in areas, factories, on ships that visited many parts of the world and had many different kinds of people as co-workers. I further engaged in informal relationships. And then when I started to study at university, my professor was also an anthropologist as well as a psychologist. So in a sense, I had no choice but to use these experiences and these issues as part of the psychological work that I have done in the last 50 or so years. There are hundreds of definitions of culture. I like to use a relatively simple one, and it's the way of life, the shared way of life of a group of people who live together. And that includes almost anything that they share, including language and daily customs and beliefs and religions and social relationships, symbols, myths, meanings, and all of that can be incorporated in a definition of culture that's relatively simple. What do we share as a group of people who live together on a relatively permanent basis? What is strange about psychology is that for a long time, the most important context for human development, the culture in which we grow, was ignored. And that's because dominant cultures assume their culture is the only one. And so the possibility that other cultures could provide different contexts for different ways of developing and behaving was only discovered really less than 100 years ago. And the movement in psychology to make it culturally relevant or culturally appropriate is probably no more than 50 years since that movement, the movement for cross-cultural psychology or intercultural psychology began to rise. Yeah. So we formed an association in the early 1970s, a new journal of cross-cultural psychology, Journal of Intercultural Relations, also in the 1970s. And since then, the concept of culture has become quite central to the discipline. For example, in a book published by the International Union of Psychological Science on basic concepts in psychology, motivation, learning, thinking, perception, the word culture appeared as its own chapter, and that was a real breakthrough. Oh, sure. The school of sociocultural psychology, Vygotsky, Luria, and so on, really established, along with the work of others at the time, really established the role of culture. But it wasn't widely influential in the whole world of psychology until about the same time as I mentioned. It was clearly present and important here, but only a few people outside of Russia were paying attention to that in cultural context. Yeah. Well, going back to the definition of culture, if you're talking only about one, then people assume it to be the one and only and good one. But when cultures come into contact through a whole variety of reasons, colonization is one that has existed for a long time. China and India colonized Southeast Asia, for example, thousands of years ago. But we tend to think of colonization as a European phenomenon in the Western continents and in Africa and to some extent in Asia. Now it's mainly driven by migration. And the consequences of migration are that first you have many different cultural communities trying to live together in a society. Most countries try to deal with the challenges initially by forcing those who are different from the dominant group to become like the dominant group, to try to assimilate them. This has been true for indigenous people all over the world. Get rid of their culture, make them like us, and then everything will be fine. And that was also applied to immigrants with the same mindset that ours is the superior culture and other people will benefit if they become like us. This has not happened anywhere in the world. Cultures do not disappear happily. People value them and retain them. So the question then becomes, how can you live with multiple cultures within a society? And the most recent work that I've been doing, a lot of it based here in the Higher School of Economics, is trying to answer that question. Are there any basic principles about how people can live together? And that's what I'll be talking about today. I think there are some basic principles. I've been looking at 3 possibilities, but there are others. So basic principles in psychology are those shared processes that every group, every individual in every group, anywhere in the world has. But what culture does is to shape the development and expression of these basic principles so that at the surface level they look quite different. So we know from language that there are some basic principles in linguistics, but every culture uses these basic principles and sounds to create languages that are very different. But they're not all different. There are language families, there are other similarities. So if there weren't these underlying similarities, we could not have intercultural relations. You couldn't have translation from one language to another. You couldn't have understandings of how to relate to people unless there were these underlying similarities. So it's at the surface level that the differences appear, and they're the most interesting to most people. But what cross-cultural and intercultural psychologists are interested in is finding out what holds us all together beneath these surface variations. And that's what I've been trying to find. I think it's not so much the current research questions, but what to do with the results of research. How can we use them? How can we influence policymakers? How can we influence legislators? How can we influence fellow citizens who vote? There is a lot of knowledge now accumulated about how to live together successfully. But most of it is challenged by political ideology and fears that are manipulated. And so we have a responsibility to use our knowledge, to share it, to try to convince people that cultural differences are surface differences, that we all have ways of living together if we learn how to do it. We also have to take responsibility for the situations that have created the flows of people, migration flows. So, for example, yesterday at a symposium on migration, we heard from people in different countries about how psychologists are trying to help refugees and immigrants. Well, that's essential, but it doesn't recognize why people are moving and how our countries, mainly in the West, have disrupted and created turmoil in these societies that makes us morally responsible for these people fleeing from situations that are a result of our interference So we need to take this information and share it and convince our fellow citizens and our politicians that our responsibility is not just to help people fix them up and throw them back into a bad situation, but to fix the situations themselves using the knowledge that we have.